Hello and welcome to Merlin's Manor. Today I'm going to be giving my thoughts on the Adventure Book series of board games designed by Ryan Miller and published by Ravensburger Games. There are currently 3 of these games: The Princess Bride, The Wizard of Oz, and The Lord of the Rings. The gameplay for all 3 of these games is very similar. Players are going to take turns controlling various characters, trying to move them around the board and accomplish various tasks before a deck of cards runs out or another loss condition is triggered. There are various tasks that must be completed by positioning characters in specific locations and then spending cards with various icons on them in order to complete challenges. At the start of your turn, you can move any character or characters up to 2 spaces total, 1 space each, or moving 1 character 2 spaces. Then you can spend more cards to move characters additional spaces if desired. There are also special cards that you will earn throughout the game which have abilities that can be pretty powerful. You also have the chapter cards that are going to have numbers on them, like we see this one here, as well as some flavor text. And then it'll tell you what to do. In Princess Bride, it actually has it in the book itself. This one, you actually are going to shuffle the chapter cards themselves. And in this one, you have a plot card that's going to tell you what the numbers mean for the Lord of the Rings. These are typically bad things that are going to work against you, and you have to balance countering what the cards do with working towards the goals. And when that deck runs out of cards, the game is lost, so you cannot take your time too much. The Princess Bride and Wizard of Oz plays over 6 chapters, which are all separate games, but you can carry over certain benefits from game to game, including the special cards that you have unlocked. The Lord of the Rings plays over 8 chapters and adds in 1 ring cards and a special corruption mechanism, which makes the game a bit more difficult. You typically want to hold off on playing ring cards unless you absolutely need to, and don't want to discard them either because they cost a corruption to use or to discard, so they can clog up your hand there. Occasionally you'll want to go ahead and use these either as a wild to accomplish a challenge or for the special ability for that chapter, but you must use them sparingly because if you get to the end of this corruption track, which has 15 spaces on it, over the course of all 8 chapters, then you'll lose the game. You also gain corruption if you lose a chapter, and sometimes the luck of which cards come up for challenges or which order the chapter cards come up can really mess you up and cause you to lose, while other times the stars align and everything comes up just the way you need it. And other times you have to rely on a couple rings to make it, and you make it by the skin of your teeth. And that is basically how these games play. So let's get into my review of these games. Starting with the art and components. The art and components are very similar across these games. The star of these games is the adventure books themselves, which become the boards. They look great. They are very functional. They got everything you need to play each chapter right on there as far as your instructions go. And so, just really nice part of this. It is the star of the show here. Now, each chapter also fully contains the setup instructions, rules, and challenges for that particular chapter, with a card that tells you what the numbers on the chapter mean for some of those, and for some of them it's actually written in the book there. I really like how it feels like a storybook is coming to life from this format here. It reminds me a little bit of the pop-up books, except in this case you have actual miniatures that you are moving across the board instead of a pop-up. The miniatures themselves are not of the greatest quality, but they are colored various colors to help you distinguish the characters from each other, and they do look like the characters that they are modeled after. Beyond that, there are a bunch of cardboard pieces that are pretty basic. The cards themselves are also fairly cheap feeling, so you're not going to be the most impressed by the cards, but they do work. Now let's get into the ease of play. As far as the ease of play goes, I find these games very easy to learn. What you do is fairly basic. You move any character up to 2 spaces total, then play cards to do various tasks by meeting the symbols that are needed, or playing special cards for their abilities, which are clearly written on them what they do. Each round is also going to have something happen based on the story card. You'll flip a card from the deck which has a number on it. You just look up that number on the chapter card or the book, and you perform the action listed there. Often this is going to trigger something bad, but sometimes it has no effect and sometimes even has a beneficial effect. I will say that the Lord of the Rings adds some complexity with the addition of the One Ring, which can be a wild icon or trigger a special ability for the round, and when used or discarded comes with that cost of going down the track that leads to losing the game there, if you ever reach the end of that track. And so there's extra complexity there in the Lord of the Rings version, but even the Lord of the Rings version is not too complex overall, as it follows the same basic formula as the others. Now let's get into my thoughts on the game itself and how it plays. I enjoy these games for the most part. They are definitely on the lighter side, and I would say The Princess Bride is almost too easy to win, and Wizard of Oz is still fairly easy to win, with the Lord of the Rings being the hardest of them to win, but some of this is also dependent on luck as well as the strategy that you're employing there. If the wrong cards come up at the wrong time in any of these games, then it can lead to a loss, though this is more the case in the Lord of the Rings version. We lost our first campaign of the Lord of the Rings adventure book after just a few games in, but then we did breeze through our second campaign with some tight games along the way. I like the progression where you are able to add special cards to your deck which stay in from game to game, as well as some carryover of special tokens. The carryover of the corruption track adds quite a bit of tension to the Lord of the Rings version, as you often have a tough decision between using a One Ring card or two to help you win that chapter, but at the cost of going up on that corruption track. Plus, if you don't win even after using them, then you've wasted those track movements and still have to beat the scenario that you lost despite paying a rather costly cost. I also like that you can choose to trade a card with another player to help a current player complete a task, or even to help the next player to be able to accomplish a task. And the fact that you can only trade a single card keeps things from being too easy. You have to plan ahead a bit in this game and work out where various characters need to be, and sometimes even evaluate the odds of certain chapter cards coming up and how to prepare for those contingencies. Some of the chapter cards can be frustrating if certain things get undone that you just fixed, but often in those chapters you're meant to juggle a few things, and that's just part of the puzzle. And in others that are a bit more serious, there are ways you can prepare ahead for the problems, or you can just push your luck to try to finish before the wrong thing comes up. There's also a multi-use aspect to the cards, as they can be either used for their primary purpose of fulfilling symbol requirements for completing tasks, or they can be discarded to provide extra movement. Also in these games, you'll be working together and controlling all of the characters and trying to time things so that characters are in a place when someone is able to fulfill a task related to that required location, or sometimes having multiple characters in multiple locations at that right time. Again, these games are all pretty light games from a complexity standpoint and from a strategic perspective, with the Lord of the Rings being just a little more complex and just a little bit more strategically difficult than the others. They all offer a bit of a puzzle to sort out, with randomized elements via the cards you draw for your hand, as well as the cards that will be drawn from the chapter deck. While I did not find the gameplay in these games to be great, they did offer me a good experience. Now let's get into talking about how replayable these games are. I would say after a playthrough or two of the books, you might just be done with them, unless you just desire to keep going through them for a bit of nostalgia from time to time. Not much changes up between playthroughs, just the luck of the draw for the cards, which order things will happen. Lord of the Rings will provide a little more replayability, simply because it's more difficult to win, so it might take a few playthroughs to win the game. We played through Princess Bride twice with a different third player and are ready to move on after that. Played through The Wizard of Oz once and are moving on from it. And we played through The Lord of the Rings until we won, which was on our second playthrough of the campaign there. And now we're ready to move on. There are 6 chapters for The Princess Bride as well as for The Wizard of Oz. And The Lord of the Rings has 8 chapters, so being a little bit more games to play through there. Keep in mind, losing chapters will require you to replay them. Now, your mileage may vary, but I feel these games are beat the entire story once or twice and then move on from there. Let's talk about the theme. The theme is the highlight of these games. The fact that you are playing through the story pulls you into the game if you are already a fan of the story, and it provides a sense of nostalgia. The fact that you are playing on an actual storybook can also fuel the sense of immersion into the story. I definitely found it worthwhile to play through these games just from the sense of playing through the stories themselves for the experience of going through the stories, even though I found the gameplay itself to be quite basic. If you are a fan of any of these IPs, you might find yourself pulled into the game from the perspective of the theme alone. Now let's get into my final thoughts on these games. Overall, I enjoyed all of these games for a playthrough or two of their 6 to 8 chapter campaigns. They are an interactive way to experience the stories, providing a bit of a puzzle to solve for each chapter with some random chance thrown in both by the cards you draw for your hand as well as the story driving cards that often have something negative happen. As far as my rating for each of these games go, I'll give The Princess Bride a 6 out of 10, The Wizard of Oz a 6 out of 10, and The Lord of the Rings I'm giving a 7 out of 10. The lack of replayability and ease of victory are two of the things that caused lower scores for these games, in particular The Princess Bride and The Wizard of Oz. The Lord of the Rings got a bit better of a rating because of the added complexity from the One Ring cards and the track that went with them, as well as how the chapters were a little more challenging to complete. If you enjoy the IPs these games are based off of and don't mind very lightweight games, then you might enjoy these adventure book games. If you're looking for a meatier strategy game, then you might just want to pass on these games. At the end of the day, these games are pretty inexpensive and provide a nice experience for the price. I hope that you have gotten something from today's video, whether these are games that you might want to check out, try for yourself, and hope you have a great week and keep on gaming.